In the heart of New York City once stood 7 of the most extravagant mansions ever built. These were not merely houses, they were symbols of wealth, ambition, and power, palaces crafted from marble, gold, and the grandest of dreams. Yet today, they have vanished completely, leaving the streets of Manhattan looking entirely different than they did a century ago. This is the story of how 7 architectural masterpieces, built with the intent to last forever, disappeared without a trace. The day the marble fell was not just a loss for the families who owned them, but for the history of the city itself. It was January 1948, and New York City was losing something irreplaceable. On Riverside Drive, the Charles M. Schwab Mansion, once one of the grandest homes ever built in America, was being systematically torn down. The air was thick with the dust of pulverized limestone and the echoes of heavy machinery, marking the end of an era that had defined the American skyline. The Schwab Mansion was no ordinary house. Finished in 1906, it represented the very height of American ambition, wealth, and power during the era known as the Gilded Age. Built by the legendary steel tycoon Charles M. Schwab, it featured 75 rooms filled with marble, bronze, and mahogany, materials hand-picked and imported from across the globe. It was a place where money was no object and luxury was the standard for every square inch. Schwab himself was a true rags-to-riches figure, a man whose life story embodied the American dream. Born into modest circumstances in Pennsylvania, he rose quickly through the ranks of Andrew Carnegie's steel empire. His talent and relentless work ethic eventually propelled him to the presidency of Carnegie Steel, and he later went on to form Bethlehem Steel, which became a titan of global industry. At the peak of his success, Schwab was one of the richest men in the world, admired and envied by peers who marveled at his seemingly unlimited fortune. His mansion reflected exactly that, unlimited ambition and boundless wealth. However, the tragedy of the Gilded Age is that fortunes can fade as quickly as they rise, and Charles Schwab's story was no exception. Despite his tremendous business achievements and his pivotal role in building the infrastructure of America, Schwab was known for an incredibly extravagant lifestyle. He hosted lavish parties where champagne flowed like water and guests were entertained with a level of opulence that was almost incomprehensible. But he also possessed reckless gambling habits and a penchant for spending that became so extreme that even his vast wealth could not keep pace. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the ensuing Great Depression severely crippled Schwab's finances. By the late 1930s, the man who had once commanded a steel empire was nearly broke. The mansion, once the shining symbol of his great success, became an unsustainable burden. Its annual maintenance alone cost a small fortune, and the economic realities of the Depression era made it impossible to sell to another private owner. Schwab died in relative obscurity in 1939, leaving behind a mansion that nobody could afford or wanted to keep. In the years following his death, city officials and developers debated various potential uses for the massive building. Ideas ranged from converting it into a public museum or a government building to using it as office space for the city's growing bureaucracy. However, none of these plans ever materialized due to the sheer cost of renovation and the shift in architectural tastes. Ultimately, the decision was made to demolish the mansion entirely to make way for modern apartment housing. And so, on that cold winter day in 1948, New Yorkers gathered to watch as wrecking balls smashed through walls that had once hosted America's wealthiest and most powerful families. Marble columns, once polished by hand to a mirror finish, fell carelessly into piles of gray rubble. Bronze fittings and rare wood paneling that had been imported from European forests were discarded without ceremony. By 1950, the lavish mansion had vanished completely, replaced by a modest apartment complex known as Schwab House, efficient, practical, but entirely without the grandeur of its predecessor. To fully understand the incredible mansions that once defined New York City's skyline, we have to step back into the fascinating era known as the Gilded Age. This was a period stretching roughly from the 1870s to the early 1900s, a time unlike any other in American history. It was marked by unprecedented wealth, extravagant lifestyles, and towering ambition that reshaped the nation. In many ways, this era laid the groundwork for the America we recognize today, transitioning from an agrarian society to a global industrial powerhouse. At the heart of this transformation were men and women whose names are still etched into the fabric of the country: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan, and Astor. These tycoons amassed colossal fortunes through steel, railroads, oil, banking, and real estate. While they were often called robber barons due to their ruthless business practices, they were also celebrated as titans who defined what it meant to be successful in the new American world. The growth of their immense fortunes paralleled the explosive expansion of American industry. Railroads connected distant cities, factories churned out products at rates previously unimaginable, and the rise of banking and finance reshaped global markets. In this brave new world, wealth wasn't merely accumulated, it was flaunted. America was becoming richer faster than ever before, and nowhere was this newfound prosperity more evident than in the architecture of the period. It wasn't long before the country's richest citizens turned their attention to building homes that matched their towering egos and social status. New York City quickly became the preferred showcase for these magnificent mansions. As the nation's economic powerhouse and cultural capital, it provided the grand stage upon which America's elite could display their wealth and power to the rest of the world. By the late 1800s, Fifth Avenue had transformed from a quiet residential street into the most famous thoroughfare in America. The wealthy flocked to it, erecting palaces along its tree-lined sidewalks in a concentrated display of opulence that the world had never seen. It soon earned a new nickname, Millionaires' Row. The name alone was a statement, an unabashed celebration of financial triumph. But these weren't just ordinary homes. The mansions of Millionaires' Row were architectural masterpieces. Many of America's wealthiest families drew inspiration from Europe, especially France, importing an extravagant and elegant style known as Beaux-Arts. Named after the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, this architectural movement symbolized grandeur, classical elegance, and a belief that no expense was too great to create perfection. Beaux-Arts architecture emphasized symmetry, elaborate decoration, and grand proportions, designed to make an impression not just on guests, but on the world at large. Each mansion was a statement piece, a visible demonstration of power and sophistication. The interiors of these homes were nothing short of breathtaking. Marble staircases rose majestically beneath sparkling crystal chandeliers that could weigh several tons. Opulent ballrooms were built to accommodate hundreds of guests dancing beneath painted ceilings depicting elaborate mythological scenes. Libraries featured walls lined from floor to ceiling with rare books bound in leather and gold leaf, often imported directly from Europe to give the impression of established lineage. Even private rooms like bedrooms and bathrooms received extraordinary attention, adorned with silk wallpaper, intricate woodwork, and lavish fixtures. These homes were designed as monuments to the dreams and excesses of the men and women who shaped America. Yet, beneath the surface glamour lay an uneasy tension. As these homes rose along Fifth Avenue, critics began to question their extreme excess. Newspapers and reformers spoke out against the opulence, contrasting the luxurious mansions with the poverty and hardship faced by millions of other New Yorkers living in cramped tenements just a few miles away. The disparities of wealth were stark, and the mansions on Millionaires' Row became symbols of both intense admiration and deep resentment. But criticism did little to dampen the ambition of the era. Families like the Astors, Carnegies, Morgans, and Rockefellers were busy reshaping America itself. Their investments transformed industries, and their philanthropy created the libraries, museums, and schools that still exist today. Their mansions were statements about what America was becoming, a land of immense potential and almost limitless ambition. However, as quickly as the Gilded Age arrived, it also began to fade, leaving these monuments vulnerable to the rapid evolution of the city they helped build. To truly grasp the magnificence and sheer extravagance of the forgotten mansions of New York's Gilded Age, we need to understand something critical. These homes weren't just grand, they were revolutionary. At a time when most Americans still lived without basic amenities we now take for granted, the wealthiest families of this period were busy reshaping what it meant to live comfortably. They didn't just follow trends, they created them, turning luxury living into a high-tech art form. Imagine stepping into a home in the late 1800s and finding not only exquisite beauty, but cutting-edge technology at every turn. While most American households still relied on wood stoves for warmth, candles and gas lamps for light, and trips to an outhouse or public bath for sanitation, the mansions of Millionaires' Row showcased technologies decades ahead of their time. Private electric plants, elevators, air conditioning, and materials imported from every corner of the globe were not unusual, they were expected. Consider electricity, perhaps the most remarkable advancement of the era. While Thomas Edison's electric bulbs first flickered to life in Menlo Park in 1879, it took decades for electric lighting to become commonplace in American homes. But not in the mansions of the Gilded Age. Wealthy homeowners didn't wait for municipal infrastructure, they created their own. Each grand mansion was equipped with a private power plant that could generate electricity independently, illuminating hundreds of bulbs to dazzle guests at nightly galas. The effect was transformative. Nighttime became as bright as day, instantly elevating a homeowner's social prestige and allowing for a level of nocturnal socializing previously impossible. But lighting was merely the start. Electrically powered elevators, once reserved for factories and hotels, soon found their way into these private residences. The introduction of elevators radically altered mansion design. Staircases, once central to architectural layouts, became ornamental rather than essential. Now, with elevators whisking guests effortlessly between floors, homes could grow taller and more imposing, boasting multiple levels filled with rooms designed specifically for leisure, entertainment, and the display of wealth. These elevators were marvels of early engineering. Made of polished brass and mahogany, upholstered with plush velvet seating, and operated by uniformed attendants, they weren't simply functional. They were symbols of status. Even climate control, now a standard feature in every American home, traces its roots back to the Gilded Age. Early forms of air conditioning began to emerge in these palatial homes, utilizing elaborate systems of chilled water and fans to cool entire rooms, creating comfortable environments during hot New York summers. At a time when most residents struggled through sweltering July nights with nothing more than open windows, these privileged households enjoyed perfectly controlled temperatures. They didn't just escape discomfort, they redefined comfort itself. Of course, no home symbolized wealth and taste without exquisite interiors. Materials imported from every corner of the globe adorned walls, floors, and ceilings. Rare woods like mahogany from South America, ebony from Africa, and exotic teak from Southeast Asia were carefully chosen for their beauty and prestige. Marble, too, was integral to Gilded Age style. Prized Italian and Greek marble, gleaming white Carrara, and dramatic dark-veined Nero Marina were sourced at enormous expense and shipped across the Atlantic. Master craftsmen transformed these blocks into magnificent fireplaces, grand staircases, and statues. The marble didn't merely decorate the homes, it elevated them, communicating the homeowner's wealth without uttering a word. Yet, beyond their aesthetic beauty, these materials presented an enormous engineering challenge. Architects had to find innovative ways to support their immense weight. Advanced structural engineering and steel framing techniques, the same ones that later defined modern skyscraper construction, were first employed in these luxurious homes. Indoor plumbing was another groundbreaking luxury. In an era when many families fetched water from communal wells, mansions had entire plumbing systems supplying fresh water to bathrooms, kitchens, and even private indoor swimming pools. The luxury of unlimited hot water was once a privilege reserved exclusively for the wealthiest. These innovations gradually shaped expectations for homes across America, as technologies pioneered in mansions eventually trickled down to the mainstream. Above ground, the Gilded Age glittered with diamond chandeliers and rosewood staircases, but beneath the carved ceilings and velvet drapery, a parallel world hummed with quiet precision. This was the world of the servant class, a massive invisible machine that kept these 60-room palaces running like clockwork. If these mansions were kingdoms, it was the servants who actually ran them, existing in servant cities that were carefully compartmentalized and hidden from the gaze of the elite. Gilded Age mansions were designed to conceal the work behind the wonder. Entire floors were dedicated to staff, with lower basements and attic rooms tucked away and accessible only by narrow back staircases. There were separate hallways so servants could move unseen, and a complex nervous system of dumb waiters, speaking tubes, and bell systems that allowed the masters to summon help without ever seeing the effort involved. In a mansion like Charles Schwab's 75-room chateau, there might be over 40 servants on staff, working in relentless shifts to manage every second of the family's day. The vast majority of these workers were immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe, who had left behind poverty for the promise of America, only to find themselves scrubbing marble under constant scrutiny. The structure inside these homes was rigidly stratified and operated with military precision. At the top of the downstairs world was the butler, the general responsible for overseeing the male staff, managing the wine cellar, and supervising formal service. Alongside him was the housekeeper, usually a stern woman who controlled the female staff and ensured that every inch of the house was spotless. Beneath them were the cooks and kitchen maids who worked in sweltering conditions, often starting as early as 5 a.m. to prepare multi-course meals on coal-burning stoves. Footmen and valets handled clothing and luggage, often required to stand silently for hours, while parlor maids focused on the constant polishing of silver and wood. Despite working in homes filled with unimaginable luxury, the servants' own quarters were sparse and austere. Bedrooms were cramped, often shared, and located in windowless attics or damp basements. Their meals were scheduled separately from the family and eaten quickly in designated staff rooms. The daily schedule was grueling, with 14 to 16-hour shifts being the norm. Life below stairs was governed by strict rules. No romantic relationships were allowed between staff, specific dress codes were mandatory, and speaking to a member of the family without being spoken to first was often grounds for immediate dismissal. Yet, beneath this rigid hierarchy, a unique culture developed. Friendships and secret romances flourished, and stories were passed between floors as the staff supported each other through the stress of their labor. The emotional labor was just as intense as the physical work. Maids often raised the children of their employers, forming deep bonds that were publicly unacknowledged. Butlers were the keepers of the family's darkest secrets and scandals, expected to maintain total discretion at all times. Many sacrificed their own personal freedom and the chance to have their own families for the promise of continued employment, only to be dismissed the moment they became too old to serve efficiently. The fall of the Gilded Age mansions was not just a story of changing architectural tastes, it was the collapse of this entire human ecosystem. When the Great Depression hit, the first thing to go was the staff. Wealthy families downsized or moved into modern apartments where such a large workforce was no longer practical. These servants, who had dedicated their lives to palaces, were often left adrift without savings or pensions. As the mansions were demolished, the stories of the people who held them together were buried beneath the legends of the millionaires they served. We must remember them, for the Gilded Age could never have glittered without the quiet foundation they built beneath the floorboards. The Steel King's Palace, Charles M. Schwab's Riverside Chateau, was perhaps the most poignant example of this vanished grandeur. Constructed between 1902 and 1906, the mansion stood at Riverside Drive and West 73rd Street, overlooking the majestic Hudson River. At a time when the city's elite still clung to the traditional prestige of Fifth Avenue, Schwab made a bold, unconventional choice by heading to the Upper West Side. He didn't want to be just another neighbor on a crowded street, he wanted to make a definitive statement. The resulting mansion spanned a full city block and was a world unto itself. It featured a bowling alley, a sunken garden, and even private garages, an incredible luxury at a time when automobiles were still a novel curiosity for the ultra-wealthy. Wrapped in limestone and crowned with copper domes that shimmered in the sunlight, the house looked like a piece of the Loire Valley in France had been magically transported to Manhattan. Inside, the opulence was staggering. Visitors entered through massive iron gates into a grand hall adorned with imported Italian marble. There was a music room for private concerts, a Moorish smoking lounge for late-night deals, and an art gallery filled with European masterpieces. Schwab had even commissioned a grand ballroom that could host hundreds of guests simultaneously. However, as the 1920s roared to a close, the world that supported such a lifestyle began to crumble. The stock market crash of 1929 was the beginning of the end. Schwab, who had lived with a "money is no object" mentality, suddenly found himself facing the harsh reality of the Great Depression. His vast steel fortune evaporated, and the mansion he had built as a monument to his success became a hollow shell of its former glory. By the late 1930s, he was living in a small corner of the 75-room palace, unable to even pay the taxes. He eventually died in 1939, leaving a building behind that no one knew what to do with. The fate of the Schwab mansion mirrored many others along Millionaires Row. As the years rolled on, the Gilded Age began to tarnish under the weight of a new economic reality. Rising property taxes made these massive estates financial nightmares for heirs. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 meant that the era of limitless wealth was effectively over. Furthermore, the social landscape of New York was changing. The city was growing upwards, not outwards. Developers realized that the land beneath a single mansion could support a high-rise apartment building housing hundreds of families, generating far more profit than a single private residence ever could. One by one, the great palaces were sold to developers. The grand ballrooms were partitioned into offices, and the marble staircases that once felt the tread of presidents and royalty were smashed into rubble to make room for the functional, efficient skyscrapers of the modern era. Today, as we walk the streets of New York, we see little evidence that these mansions ever existed. High-rise apartments and glass office buildings have taken their place, leaving few hints about the architectural giants that once defined these neighborhoods. And yet, the fascination remains. We look back at these lost palaces not just to admire their beauty, but to understand what they represented: a time of unprecedented boldness and creativity. They were part of our cultural heritage, monuments to human ambition and the belief that anything was possible. Their disappearance changed the city forever, shifting New York from a collection of private estates into a dense, bustling metropolis. By remembering the stories of the Schwab Mansion and its contemporaries, we can better appreciate the layers of history beneath our feet. These lost mansions remind us that while stone and gold may fall, the stories of those who built them and those who worked within their walls endure. They serve as a powerful lesson on the fleeting nature of wealth and the enduring importance of preserving our architectural legacy before it vanishes completely into the shadows of time.